All right, good morning and welcome to SETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. We have a three-panel day, and this is the first of the three panels with a panel on Syria and Iraq's impact on U.S.-Turkey relations. My name is Ahmet Selim Tekelioglu, and we have a wonderful panel of three experts on the region. Dr. Hasan Basri Yalcin from Turkey, from SETA Foundation in Turkey, Sasha Ghosh-Siminoff, president and co-founder of People Demand Change, and Luke Coffey, the director of Center for Foreign Policy at Heritage Foundation. You have their extensive bios in your outlets, so please refer to these. Without further ado, we'll start the panel, and our structure will be each speaker will have about 10 minutes to speak first, and we will have a second round, and then we'll go to the Q&A session. I don't know about you, but this morning I kind of had an easier commute to DC than expected. And some say this is the last day of freedom, and tomorrow things will change. Traffic will definitely be different tomorrow, but we'll see how that will translate to the foreign policy and how that will translate to Turkish-American relations in particular. So we are looking at Syria and Iraq's impact on U.S.-Turkey relations, and our expert panel will speak to this context. And as we debate the semantics of Turkish-American relations, we used to have this debate about a decade ago, and now we are going through one of the thorniest phases in the bilateral relationship. Disagreements in Iraq and Syria factor importantly in Turkish-American relations in this dynamic, and there are a myriad of unknowns in this whole sort of context, and we hope the panel will help us go through that. While American focus remains on focusing on the fight against ISIS in both contexts, the Syria-Assad regime revitalized, and Turkish concerns on both ISIS and the YPG increase will be facing an interesting period to come. So let me first turn to Hasan and ask Hasan if you could please walk us through the Turkish-American relationship and Turkish perspective on where Syria and Iraq fit in the overall dynamic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ahmet. I will try to make a general short introduction about the recent situation in Turkish-American relations. And we are, as you shortly mentioned, having some strange days in these days, and we are not sure about what's coming ahead. So I can conceptualize these days some sort of uncertainty days. We are strictly concerned how Trump administration is going to react in the affairs in the Middle East, and how other states are going to react to Trump administration's new foreign policy decisions in the Middle East. Turkey is one of them, and Turkey is just because of some recent events, some recent experiences Turkey faced with. Are we having a problem with this? No. Since Turkey had quite strange problems with the Obama administration's Middle Eastern politics, in Turkey, people are really concerned about what kind of an approach is going to become the primary approach during the Trump administration. As you all know, this is not anymore a secret. During the Obama period, Turkish-American relations, things for Turkish-American relations really didn't work well. So this is not anymore a secret, but this is not just case for Turkish-American relations. If you just look at to the entire Middle East, you will see that America had similar strains with all of its traditional allies at the expense of the expansion of influences of America's more traditional rivals. You can see this in both Syria and Iraq. In Iraq today, Iran had a really great sphere of influence. In Syria, both Iran and Russia had gained quite important power. Therefore, Turkey and similar other traditional American allies because of the Obama administration's retrenchment policy, they don't feel they feel that they are abandoned by their partners in the Middle East. This situation is actually nothing new. In the entire history of Turkish-American relations, we have seen these kinds of crisis situations, but this time it became a repeated kind of behavior, and Turkey repeatedly asked American partnership in some specific cases, especially in its fight against terrorism. But in all of these efforts, America rejected or avoided to provide what Turkish government was asking from America. Train and equip program and no-fly zones and all others concerning Syria was kindly rejected by the Obama administration. This created an unbelievable pressure over Turkish government, while Turkish government believes that they are fighting against 3 different terrorist groups. Under these situations, Obama administration, who was highly welcomed when he came into office, became a great disappointment from a Turkish perspective. But just because of this reason, Turkish people, Turkish government are quite wondering about how Trump administration is going to do in the Middle East. Maybe just if you look at his rhetoric, just if you look at his discourse about his foreign policy decisions, you will not see that Trump. There is not much to be optimistic about Trump administration's foreign policy in the Middle East. But if you look at the Obama administration period, then you will have some reasons to become optimistic about Trump. At least something is going to change. At least we don't know the exact direction of this change, but we can see there will be a change at least. This at least makes Turkey a little bit encouraged about this situation. When we look at from Turkey's perspective, I can see 3 different scenarios. Those are mutually exclusive of each other. Trump administration will probably follow, might prefer some kind of interventionist foreign policy in the Middle East. The second approach might be a non-interventionist foreign policy approach. The third one might be, as in the case of Obama administration, cooperating with PYD and Russia and others at the expense of Turkish government. These 3 scenarios will probably have different responses from Turkey. If you look at the first scenario, you can actually make more detailed pictures of all these scenarios. If you look at to the first scenario, if America becomes much more interventionist in the coming days of Syrian America's approach to Syria, then you can predict to some extent Turkey will prefer to cooperate with the United States more than Turkey prefers to cooperate with Russia. Because Turkish-Russian rapprochement in the last 6 months, let's say, or 5 months, was not an outcome of just Turkish preferences. It was an outcome of American approach to Turkey. Despite repeated demands from Turkish government, America didn't reconsider its position, its support for PYD, and Turkey right now considers PYD as number 1 security concern. Therefore, Turkish approach in fighting against different terrorist groups had to come a conclusion. If America, our first choice, is not supporting us in our fight against terrorism, then there is only one solution. We should cooperate with other states in fighting against terrorism. When I was here in another SETA meeting 7 months ago, I implied this. It was before the coup attempt of July. I implied to some extent Turkey might consider allying with Russia against PYD or some other groups in Syria, but it was just before the coup attempt. After the coup attempt, in 1 month, we all observed that Turkey had no other choice but to join with Russia in Syria and cooperate with Russia, maybe against the protests of American government. So I expect that if America, under the Trump administration, prefers to become more interventionist, Turkey would reconsider its decision to work with Russia, and Turkey might easily swing towards the United States. But if Trump administration prefers another approach towards Middle East, or let's say specifically in case of Syria, then Turkish response will also change. If America keeps working in the way chosen by Obama administration, then Turkish response will be directly building more concrete relations with Russia and Iran. Then I will expect that Turkey will swing towards Russia and Iran despite its own concerns about having strict relations with those countries. This is my second scenario, and this is my second expectation how Turkey will react in that case. And I find another scenario that's the entire non-involvement scenario. If Trump really chooses not to intervene any affairs in the Middle East, as he proclaimed in some of his rhetoric during the elections period, then we will see that Turkey will build a more balanced relation between Russia and America. Maybe in that case, Turkey will not just cooperate with full force with Russia, but will try to build a balance between Russia and the United States. But in that case, Turkey will prefer this case as the second best option. The first best option is probably going to be the more interventionist Trump administration in Syria under UN resolution, maybe would be the first option. But the second option might be a non-involvement and Turkey having a balanced relation between Russia and America. But the worst option is keeping the way of Obama administration. In that situation, Turkey believes that Syrian territorial integrity is under threat. So this is the worst option, the worst scenario for Turkey. In that case, Turkey will have no other choice than joining with Russia. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. These three scenarios definitely merits more discussion in Q&A session. If I may move from here to Sasha, just to use Hasan's comments. Sasha, you have extensive experience in the field working with Syrians of all backgrounds, both in Syria and in the diaspora. So if you could, walk us through, how, especially from within the opposition, different and civilian populations, the dynamic is being seen, and your experiences in regards to the impact of Turkish-American relations in both, Syrian and Iraqi contexts. Thank you.
Thank you as always, Jasita, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here right before the inauguration. I think we'll see many changes going forward over the next 4 years in terms of American foreign policy towards the MENA region especially. In terms of the Syrian opposition, its perspective, I think there's a couple things to bear in mind. From the get-go, Turkey has been a big supporter of the Syrian opposition. We can debate the reasons why they supported and who they supported, but if we look at the facts, they've taken in the most refugees. They've allowed their borders to be open to allow humanitarian aid, billions of dollars of humanitarian aid, frankly, to support the opposition-held areas in the north. They have worked hard to find some consistent balance between the aspirations of the Syrian people, who from the get-go have explained that at the root of the problem is that the Assad regime is still in power, and that so long as the Assad regime is still in power, it is very difficult to find a way out of this conflict. And I think that issue and that base problem still remains. I think that from the perspective of the Syrian opposition, in the north especially, because the Syrian opposition is not a monolithic structure. In the north, the support of Turkey has been key in defending the areas that it has held. And I think in terms of consistent support, American support has been inconsistent. Turkish support has been consistent. I think that going forward, one of the key aspects is whether the United States and Turkey can come to an agreement about how a strategy of supporting the opposition will move forward. For example, with Operation Euphrates Shield, when Turkey and the United States worked together, they made gains very quickly in expelling ISIS from the border of Turkey, which is both good for Turkey's national security interests and also good for the United States. I think there are many places in which Turkey and the United States align in terms of what they want to see inside Syria. They want a stable, unified country that has the capacity to dig itself out of the current conflict. How we get there has been a sticking point between the United States and Turkey for the past 6 years. If we continue to have that as a sticking point, it's going to be difficult to see how we're going to have a cohesive strategy. At this point, given the multifaceted nature of the Syrian conflict, I think it's really important that the Trump administration moving forward finds a way to balance the needs and requirements of all the regional actors that are traditional allies of the United States, coupled with the aspirations of the Syrian people, coupled with the reality that we have a major problem in terms of security and terrorism that's plaguing both Turkey, that threatens Europe, and also threatens the United States. So these are a lot of things to balance, but I think with a frank discussion with Turkey about what needs to be done going forward, I think a way can be found. For the Syrian opposition, again, it's about the base question. Is the Assad regime going to stay? Will the country be unified or not? Where and how will the massive refugee populations that are now sitting within Turkey and Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, how will these people be allowed to return? Can they return? How will their political rights be guaranteed should a transitional government take over if Assad steps down? These are questions that need to be answered. There needs to be a strategy because the current practice of the Obama administration, which has been a non-strategy, just simply doesn't work. And we need a strategy, one way or the other. I think for a lot of people in the region, whether it's the Syrian opposition, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, anyone, at this point, they just want to know in what direction is the U.S. government heading, what is their plan, for better or for worse, whether people like it or don't like it. They just need to know this is the way forward, and we, as the Syrian opposition or the other countries in the region, we're gonna fit ourselves accordingly to what we feel is the plan and the strategy moving forward, and people can actually make concrete long-term plans for how they're going to proceed.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I mean, this is definitely great, and maybe in the Q&A we'll get to how the Trump administration may develop a relationship with the opposition. But now let's move to Luke, who has an expertise in not only the transatlantic relations but also in the regional politics. So Luke, if you could sort of walk us through what we may expect in the coming era from both as it regards Iraq and Syria, and also how the transatlantic sort of relationship may factor into that dynamic.
Well, let me see if Trump's tweeted anything about this quickly this morning while I've been sitting here. No, Ahmet, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you to SETA for inviting me to speak here, and thank you everyone for coming to this event today. I would like to focus a bit on some of the friction points between Turkey and the U.S. as they apply to Syria and Iraq, and I can elaborate on what I think Trump administration might do, although, as it's already been alluded to, there's not too much actually to base any sort of policy assumptions on. But nevertheless, there is some ideas that have been floated, some things you do hear around town that we can draw some sort of conclusion on how the next administration might handle these things. But as Hasan said, and as I hear continuously throughout those in the region, it can't get any worse than what it is now. That's what we're told. So that is a pretty low bar to get over for the next administration. The Turkish-U.S. relations have been strained because of events in Syria, without a doubt. And the strain has created a number of friction points and connected to different policy areas, which have really accentuated the problem the U.S. has had not only with Turkey but with other allies in the region. I think a lot of this comes down to the Obama administration's policy on Syria, which I could describe like this. It's to do the bare minimum possible, to make it look like you're doing something, but in reality you're not doing very much, if anything at all. And we saw this from the very bland, lackluster calls for Assad to leave early on in this conflict without backing that up with any action. We saw this with the infamous red line, the use of chemical weapons. You know, if President Obama was going to get congressional approval to enforce his red line, then he probably should have sought congressional advice before drawing his red line. The way he handled that was a complete fiasco. And then you have some of the other issues about surrounding who the U.S. is supporting in the region. And this is one of the main friction points between U.S. and Turkish relations, and specifically I'm talking about U.S. support to groups like PYD. And of course its armed affiliate, the YPG. If more Americans knew that U.S. tax money and the lives of U.S. soldiers were being put at risk to help train, fight alongside, and work with what is essentially a Marxist extremist organization with links to the PKK, which is a designated terrorist organization by the United States, I think there would be an outrage. You hear often stories pop up in the press or on blogs or whatnot about U.S. Special Operation forces who say that they feel disenchanted by this mission, that these people we're working with in Syria really don't have U.S. interests at play. You saw these pictures of U.S. Special Forces wearing shoulder patches. And it's like we're completely divorced from reality on how this is going to be seen in Turkey. Like we don't even make the effort as policymakers to see how this could even be possibly be a problem. And this is because there's a larger problem in the U.S. policy community that I would describe as laziness when it comes to dealing with the Kurdish question. If you talk to your average Hill staffer, congressman, policymaker, the Kurds are the Kurds. There's just the Kurds. All the Kurds are great. We must support all the Kurds. There's no differentiation between the KRG, the PKK, the HDP, the PYD, the YPG. To the average policymaker, this is just a sea of acronyms that they just can't get around. And to make the matters worse, the acronyms are derived from the transliteration of the group's name in its original language and not from anything based off English. So it's just beyond the ability for many to dive deeply enough to understand that, hey, maybe the U.S. shouldn't be supporting a neo-Marxist extremist group that is not only attacking a NATO ally, Turkey, but is also involved in attacking other groups in Syria that's being funded by U.S. taxpayers. So we have this curious situation where the U.S. taxpayer is basically funding battles between various groups that we're backing and funding. I mean, you couldn't make it up. And if more Americans knew this, I think there would be, there'd be more of an outcry. Now, I think President-elect Trump, soon-to-be President Trump, we'll see a change with this. He's already said, whether or not you can take what he said on the campaign trail as being policy, but he has said that he wants to question the idea of U.S. support to some of the rebel groups. And in the year 2017, I have to say, I believe most of the moderates have either been killed or they've left. And it seems like the more, and those that are remaining really aren't big enough to tilt it one way or the other. And it seems that the more desperate Western policymakers become over Syria, the more moderate the rebels become, like it's magic. And I think we're just so desperately trying to figure out how we can engineer an outcome in Syria that's acceptable to us that we become blinded to some of the realities. Another area of friction between the U.S. and Turkey vis-a-vis Syria is Russia, as was already mentioned. This perceived rapprochement between Ankara and Moscow. This doesn't excite me too much. I think this is, as was already pointed out, driven by the realities of the U.S.-Turkish relationship, and Turkey is hedging its bets in a way on who's going to be the dominant actor in the Syrian civil war. But at the end of the day, I think this is going to end in tears because Turkey and Russia share the same common interests in Syria in the same way a customer and a robber share the same common interests with a bank. And history has told us, going back centuries, that Russia and Turkey and their interests and their objectives and their vision for that broader region do not match. And just because there's a rapprochement of handshaking and whatnot in Moscow does not undo almost 5 centuries of animosity, competition, and conflict between Turkey and Russia. But this does have an impact on Turkey's relationship with NATO. And you hear all these rumors that Russian planes will be using Incirlik and U.S. forces will be kicked out and this and that. A lot of this is just the rumor mill. A lot of this is set in Turkey for domestic consumption. I get all that. But without a doubt, people are seeing, transatlantic security policy experts in D.C. at least are seeing all of this through the NATO lens and not necessarily through a broader geostrategic lens of Syria, Iraq, and the broader region. And then there's a final concern that's probably more on a tactical level, and that is the impact that the aftermath of the coup attempt has had on the readiness of the Turkish armed forces. Now, I'm not getting into a debate on if those that have been removed from their command or kicked out of the military were guilty or not guilty or involved in the coup or not in the coup. But the reality is if you move 1/3 of your general officers, you're going to have a readiness crisis in your armed forces. If you remove large chunks of middle-ranking commanders and soldiers, you are going to have a readiness crisis inside your armed forces. And Turkey is a very important NATO member and has the alliance's second largest military. So this is a big concern for many policymakers, is how will this crisis be mitigated? And we're seeing this, I think, maybe we're seeing this even on the ground with Euphrates Shield. Without a doubt, the sort of fighting is difficult, challenging, tough fighting. And the Turkish troops have shown a lot of pluck and courage in their fighting, especially around Al-Bab. But it has also taken significant losses in armored vehicles, tanks, and whatnot. And one has to wonder, and we may never know, is this just the consequence of warfare that's bloody and deadly? Or is this a consequence of troops where morale could be low, readiness is at a low level? Or is this a combination of both of these matters? But with the Trump administration looking forward, I think there are some positive things to look at with the Turkish-U.S. relationship. I think Trump has a lot of popularity across the board in Turkey, perhaps more popular in some quarters here in the U.S. But I think that's a consequence of President Obama's popularity being so low in the region. And President Trump has made very clear that he doesn't want to meddle in the internal events of other countries. So I don't think he's even going to try, because often when the U.S. tries doing this, we fully don't understand what's happening, or we only half understand, and we end up making a huge mess of it. So I think this will probably be welcome, not just for Turkey, but probably for other countries in the region. And hopefully, in my opinion, the biggest challenge Trump has will be to restore American credibility in the region. And I think if that can be done, then we could all start singing from the same hymn sheet on how to confront some of these common challenges like we see in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think this has been a great sort of way to bring the discussion from different perspectives, the strategic perspective, the realities on the ground, and an American transatlantic perspective. So I'll pose some questions, and maybe that'll give us an opportunity to talk a little bit more, and then we'll go to the Q&A session. So let me start in the reverse order, as you're fresh, Luke. Just to play the devil's advocate,
Yeah.
one discourse that we hear in DC in regards to YPG, PYD is that it's the most effective fighting force on the ground, right? So, so that is one of my questions. How do you see this play, and then whether a new administration maybe thinks differently? A second question is if you could talk maybe a little bit about how the transatlantic perspective, more particularly maybe a British or French perspective, may diverge from the current administration sort of policy, and how that may play into the new administration's policy towards Iraq and Syria.
Yeah, well, in the first question, yeah, without a doubt, the Syrian Kurds are very gallant and courageous fighters. I mean, regardless if you believe in their ideology or support their political beliefs, you can hardly deny that. But extending that logic, you would argue that the U.S. should be arming the Taliban to fight the emergence of ISIS in Afghanistan. This is playing with fire, in my opinion, supporting groups like the YPG. You know, I'm a former U.S. soldier. I only served in Afghanistan, but if I speak to my colleagues that served both in Iraq and Afghanistan, they would say that, you know, in terms of the enemy, the Iraqi insurgents were, you know, Cub Scouts compared to fighting the Taliban. But this doesn't mean that, you know, the Taliban's courage in fighting doesn't mean that they should be an organization that we should try to support or work with. So I don't buy that logic. That, well, they're the only effective fighting force on the ground, so we have to support them. I don't buy it. On the second point about how Britain or France or other European partners can play more of a role, I think Europe is internally distracted with everything going on, not only in the Eurozone, but dealing with the fallout from the Brexit vote. And also, they are limited because of their lack of, you know, military investment, military spending over the years, and the reduction in capabilities. And I think that Britain and France in particular try to do more. They want it to be seen as that they're doing more. But in practical terms, I don't see much appetite for it domestically in either country. But the more we can get them involved, I think the better, without a doubt.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So let me go to Sasha. And Sasha, you've talked a lot about, you know, how when Turkey and US cooperate, things move faster. If you could sort of also bring us, you know, a little bit perspective from the opposition, from the civilian on the ground, and from the AIDS workers, how the dynamic is being seen by these actors themselves. You work closely with a lot of actors on the ground, and whether, for example, again, to play the devil's advocate, the Turkish-Russian rapprochement, is it seen as something strategic? Is it seen as something, okay, that is temporary until the United States changes its course and starts to cooperate with Turkey? That is question number one. And the question number two is, I wanted to ask, and we've talked a little bit about this before the panel, whether do you see any spillover from the Iraqi context as things move on in both Mosul, and then at the same time, you know, partly in Raqqa. We've seen again, you know, reports that, you know, the U.S. has identified a new force to take on the Raqqa operation. But you were talking about, and I'd like us to talk a little bit about this Iraqi context and spillover into the Syrian conflict.
Sure. So for the first question, I think, I think at the end of the day, right, the biggest problem throughout this conflict has been a lack of leadership and a lack of consistency in policy. So on the ground, you know, the Syrian opposition in the beginning, in 2011, when it was a peaceful protest movement, basically said, we're looking to the United States because you are one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful nation in the world. You have access politically, diplomatically, and resource-wise to the entire region. You can find a solution to our problem. Our problem is that we've been living under 40 years of dictatorship and we're done and we want out. And I think from the get-go, the biggest problem that I see is that there was not a clear understanding about the aspirations of the Syrian people to chart a different course for their future, number one. And number two, a lack of understanding of just how stubborn the Syrian people are and their willingness to go to very long lengths to try and secure a new future for themselves. Once this conflict entered the militarized phase, there should have been a managed militarization of this conflict in which the United States made a specific decision about whether they wanted to see an armed movement successfully overthrow the Assad regime or not. I think the United States vacillated on this point and went back. And then some days they said, oh, if the armed opposition is capable and if we can see like a actual alternative governance structure, we'll be happy to do it. And then on other days when the opposition wasn't doing well, they said, well, maybe keeping the Assad regime in place is better for stability for the region. You have to choose at some point. And the problem is that because there was never a clear choice made, other actors in the region felt that in order to either guard their borders, maintain their security interests, or deal with the regional dynamic of, frankly, Iran and the Gulf, they had to do something. And none of those choices were coordinated. I think in terms of the rapprochement between Turkey and Russia, okay, it makes sense for, let's say, northern Aleppo, where you have Operation Euphrates Shield, and there is a joint interest, in theory, between Russia and Turkey to fight ISIS. But that agreement geographically doesn't apply to Idlib and western Aleppo province and northern Hama and parts of Latakia province where, frankly, Russian and regime airstrikes are still continuing despite the ceasefire. They're still targeting civilian infrastructure. They are still, frankly, attacking projects and programs that the United States and Turkey fund on the ground, whether it's civilian hospitals, whether it's infrastructure projects for residents, new roads. All of this stuff is being funded by the United States and Turkey, or it's being funded by the United States and facilitated by Turkey at the border. So I think people understand there's some pragmatic reasons why maybe there might be, at least for now, an understanding between Russia and Turkey about certain geographic areas, but I don't think that agreement applies to the entirety of Syria. I think it's a very specific area. It's Al-Bab, it's northern Aleppo. You go to western Syria or even eastern Syria, I don't think that deal applies. And I don't think it would be an implementable deal, in part because their interests, just as everyone on the panel said, just diverge completely. The reality about Iraq and Syria is that ISIS has connected these two conflicts in a way that it's very hard to disconnect. If the United States is not prepared to have ground forces take a primary role on the ground in either Syria or Iraq, we're going to rely on local forces. If we're going to rely on local forces, we're going to have to understand first the dynamics on the ground, both politically and socially, and the interchange between these dynamics between Iraq and Syria. At the end of the day, right, Deir ez-Zor and Anbar are connected through familial links, through tribal links, through the linkages of the Iraq War over the past decade. Right now, we have people fleeing Mosul and ending up in Idlib, which shows geographically that these areas are connected, whether we want them to be connected or not. As the Iraqi army and the Iranian militias and as the Peshmerga move forward and claim more areas of ISIS control in Iraq, more pieces of ISIS are going to be pushed and squeezed back into Syria, which is going to put pressure on another front. Frankly, it will put more pressure also on Operation Euphrates Shield in Turkey, because that's where the pressure is going to be felt. It also means that we're going to have a collection potentially of IDPs in Raqqa City, which will make taking Raqqa City that much more complex, because we'll have to deal with how do we protect civilians, allow them to leave and evacuate, or potentially, as we see in Mosul, ISIS preventing people from leaving. So all of these dynamics are connected. So we can't have a divorced policy in which we do one thing in Iraq and we don't think about what it will do in Syria and vice versa.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And finally, Hasan, I mean, your three strategies, the involvement, the non-involvement, and then more or less, I guess we can phrase it as continuation of de facto semi-involvement and as such. I wanted to ask, whether you see an immediate chance for the Trump administration to look at things differently and what might be a first step for a new approach to the Iraqi and Syrian context, but also on a larger sort of field, this divergence between tactical and strategic sort of approach, and what impacts American perspective in regards to the region. Do you see an immediate role that Turkey, or an immediate chip that Turkey can play in regards to swaying the American approach in one way or another?
I don't think it's going to be in a very short period of time. So we shouldn't be so optimistic about a surprisingly fast change in U.S. position, and every problems in the region is going to be solved in just one day. No, of course not. But we need to focus on what Turkey's expectations are. Why Turkey focuses on some very specific issues. Actually, we are not living in the world of 2012. At that time period, everything was quite different. Turkey was attempting to lead a democratic transition process in the Middle East. And it was expecting the support of the United States for such a democratic process. But recently that support was cut down, and Turkey faced a totally different region. And because of that new reality, Turkey waited for the US support to come for more than 3 years, but it didn't come. At the end of that process, when Turkey was facing 3 different terrorist groups attacking systematically towards Turkey, then everything has changed. Of course, Russia is not the number one alliance choice for Turkey. Just if you look at the historical understanding between these two countries, you will see that they are going to have much more enmity relationship than having a friendly relationship. But there are some security considerations. And again, I remember 7 months ago, again in this SETA meeting, I had some questions about domestic politics of Turkey when I was trying to talk about security issues. And I repeatedly came with the same answer. Come on, guys, Turkey is having a serious security problem, and so Turkey should take some survival issues into consideration. And Turkey, just because of those survival issues, will make some certain decisions. I repeatedly tried to give the same answer. This was because in Turkey we really felt that survival at stake. Just 1 month after that meeting, Turkey had a coup attempt, and it showed us how serious was Turkey's survival concern. And just because of in this new security situation, Turkey is not just making a decision between 2 available alignment partners. No, Turkey is just trying to join with the one side, which is going to help itself in providing its own security. This is not anymore an issue of democratic transition. This is not anymore building a regional stability process. There are certain security issues at stake. So Turkey is always putting these security concerns in front of any other behavior. But
may I put a pin on this and then just ask you the points made by Sasha about Turkish army's capacity, whether there's a readiness problem and as such. Do you see any issues on that?
Yeah, actually, just after the coup attempt, we saw that a number of officers were arrested, and we observed that there are some people in Turkish military joining those terrorist groups. This showed us there was, to some extent, a readiness problem for Turkish military. But again, we saw just after 1 month of that coup attempt, Turkish military started its operation in Afrin Shield operation. And it also shows us Turkish military, despite all these unexpected people in its body, Turkish military still can operate extraterritorial places. But this doesn't mean that about this Raqqa issue and Mosul reminds me that if you look at recent sieges in both Iraq and Syria, you will see that it's not so easy to clean those big cities. Mosul operation started in a very fast fashion, but it nearly stopped right now. And Elbab operation, Turkey is having some considerable problems in Elbab operation. And we will again see that in defending Raqqa, ISIS is going to be much more powerful and much more resistant. Therefore, it's not such a simple solution. With PYD fighting on the field, no, Raqqa is not going to be cleaned by just PYD operations. I remember that guy, I don't remember your name, sorry for that, but he was just sitting near to me, he was a military guy. And I asked him, is there any chance of PYD cleaning all these areas and going towards Raqqa? We made that discussion last year, but recent events, recent sieges, actually clearly shows us it's not so easy. Probably in order to have cleaned all these cities, we will, at the end of the day, will have American troops on the field. Otherwise, it's not so easy to clean Raqqa. I don't know. This is my point.
Yeah, and then that brings us to your scenario
Yeah,
number one, which
number
is
one is probably the most. I know nobody in the United States right now expects an interventionist foreign policy coming back, especially focusing on Trump's rhetoric during the election process. But things can just change because of the real events, and just can create a new kinds of motivations for much more powerful American intervention in Syria.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I have a few burning questions, but I'll hold off on those, and we'll go to the audience. What I'll kindly ask you to do is, first, please wait for the mic. We have mics going on. And then please identify yourself and limit your questions to a short amount of time and make clear, please. Yes.
Hi, Robert Friedman from Johns Hopkins University. Question for Hasan. Sasha. Hasan, if you could define a bit more interventionist policy. Does that mean sending in U.S. troops, as you just mentioned? And for Sasha, the question is on the Turkish-Russian relationship. At least from my view, the Turks need the Russians more than the Russians need the Turks. Is that fair to say? And for that reason, Russia has not yet lifted its total embargo on, Turkish agriculture and other goods. Is that fair to say?
Thank you. That is what I call a model question.
And you even got two in there. So.
Thank you. Sasha, do you want to
Sure.
go first?
So it's hard to say. On the one hand, the sanctions, frankly, by the United States and Europe on Russia has crippled their economy. I don't think we've seen the full fallout of that quite yet. Obviously, there are links between the Turkish and Russian economies, tourism, produce and goods and services that took a toll on Turkey's economy when there was the embargo. On the other hand, I mean, Syria is Turkey's backyard. At the end of the day, and as is Iraq, I think at the end of the day, no matter what kind of a relationship they have with Russia, the immediate impact of Syria and Iraq being completely destabilized for the next few decades is not optimal nor an option for Turkey. And so I think that Turkey is going to have to look out for their interests in terms of those two nations, irrespective of their relationship with Russia. The other thing about it is that I think that Turkey can easily turn up the heat on Russia. How? They can provide more weapons and more support to the opposition in the north, and they can allow, for example, the opposition to reopen an offensive in Latakia. If that happens, I believe easily the opposition could retake huge swaths of territory they lost to the Assad regime, in part because Turkish troops were actually helping them to retake that territory. And if Russia has to reprioritize where they use their military resources inside Syria because they just can't be everywhere, realistically that means they'll have to think about protecting Latakia, which is important to the Assad regime, but it's also important to them. Their air base is there. They don't want the opposition getting too close to that or threatening the capacity for their planes to take off. This is on top of them defending, for example, the T4 air base out in Homs, which is a major air base that the Assad regime and Russia need in order to fly out of. And right now ISIS is hitting them very hard. They've surrounded that air base, not completely, but they're making it difficult to fly out of that air base right now. So I think both sides need some amount of cooperation militarily and politically with one another, but I still think their interests ultimately diverge and will continue to diverge going forward.
Thank you, Sasha.
Thank you for the question. When I talk about intervention, I mean any form of intervention. I do not exclude one option. There might be different types. UN resolution probably would be the number one Turkish preference. Acting a large coalition under the UN resolution probably would be the number one preference of Turkey. It might be no-fly zone. It might be a train and equip program. Maybe it might be reconsidered. It might come again to the table. And I also believe that a bilateral agreement between Turkey and the United States might be another option if Turkey gets enough guarantees that Turkey and the United States will act in a trustable way on the northern side of Syria. Turkey would, to some extent, Turkey would join an operation towards Raqqa if the United States clearly shows its inclination towards Turkey rather than PYD.
Thank you. Okay. Another question? Second question? I think I saw a hand over there. Yes.
Actually, I'd like each of the panelists to respond to this little bit of speculative questioning here. Is there any... That should be better. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so one way to think about getting out of the dead ends that we're in from several angles on Syria policy and in the U.S.-Turkey bilateral relationship is to imagine what it would take to stop the current cycle in Syria. So for each of the players, I'd like to get your views, and by each of the players I mean U.S., Turkey, YPG, Russia, and Assad. What does good enough look like? I can imagine that for the U.S., Raqqa out of the hands of ISIL is good enough. For the Turks, no contiguous cantons with YPG controlling all of the territory across the north is good enough. For Assad, I'm going to speculate that good enough is the unity of the Syrian state in some form, and at least the handicapping or diminishment of the threat from the opposition groups to his rule. I'm a little bit less clear on what's good enough for YPG, and they do have some cards here, and a little bit less clear on what is good enough for Russia, because I'm not sure exactly what Russia sees as the end game in the north as well. But as I think about it, something like a KRG analog in Iraq, where you have a region that is formally still part of the state, that has some cooperative relationship with the national capital, and is on reasonable terms with the neighboring states. And it took a long time to get the KRG there. And I'm not suggesting, for instance, that PYD should be the kingmaker in a Syrian north in the way that Barzani is, for instance, in the KRG. That would have to take some rollback. You'd have to see some cooperation between YPG and non-Öcalan movement Kurdish groups in the north. You'd have to see some cooperation between the Kurdish groups, Arab groups, Turkmen groups. I can imagine something like that coalescing. I'm just not sure how we get there, especially with what the Kurds are considering their minimums, because they have certainly got, the YPG, the Öcalan movement, has gotten more than I think that it thought possible. So I would like each of you to speculate maybe if that's even possible, And I will caveat that by saying I don't think the U.S. is going to do a flip-flop on the YPG, not quickly and not easily. So complicated question, but please.
I'll go first. I would also add, there are other actors that have a big vote. Iran, some of the Gulf states, what would be good enough for them would have to also be considered. Just throwing a few thoughts out there. For Russia, what would be good enough for Russia, I think, is keeping Assad or someone like Assad in power in Damascus. And what I mean by someone like Assad, that means someone who can guarantee continued access to their naval base, their new airfield, because Russia views these as strategic assets. In the same way, if Russia's not involved in Ukraine or have some sort of control or influence in Ukraine, it's merely only an Asian power, not a European power. Without these overseas bases like we see in Syria, Russia's only a regional power, not a global power. So I think this sets in Putin's mindset very firmly. So that, I think, would largely be the bare minimum good enough as, Assad or someone like Assad controlling a part of the country that allows Russia to maintain its strategic presence there. For the U.S., I think what is good enough is the restoration of Iraq's territorial integrity and a political settlement in Iraq which addresses the legitimate grievances that the Sunnis in the north have with Baghdad. And this would probably mean some sort of autonomy status for Nineveh and Mosul. And then in Syria, it would be that Syria is no longer used as a safe haven place where transnational terrorists can launch, plan, and coordinate terrorist attacks. That would probably be good enough. But like I said, there's so many other actors, and everyone's good enough is slightly different from the other. So I'll stop there and then.
Thank you.
So I think it's important to go back into history, especially with regards to Hasaka province and Jazeera region in Syria. Before the war, the PYD were not like a very large political player in Hasaka. There was like 32 political parties at least in Hasaka. KDPS is a big one there, supported by Barzani. But Assad knew, looking down the road, if you want to make Syria the regional mess that it is, you play on the divisions within the communities of Syria and you make those divisions wider. In the case of the Kurdish areas, while we don't know for sure who assassinated Michel Tammo, we do know that he was assassinated because he was a unifying force that demanded that there be a pluralistic, free Syria that incorporated Arabs, Kurds, Turkmens, Druze, everyone into a state that represented everyone and was an open state. When he was killed and numerous other actors that had his mindset were killed, it allowed other players to come to the fore that had a different way of thinking. And the question becomes, whether it's about the PYD and the YPG, is their project now going forward a Kurdish project or not? Because demographically, the more territory it takes, the more this no longer is a Kurdish project. At some point, you're going to have demographic parity between Arabs and Kurds in the areas that they control. And they're going to have to administer social services. They're going to have to provide security and a structure that incorporates those people. If they don't, we'll see an uprising at some point against the PYD, YPG, the Self-Administration Authority, whatever you want to call them. So I think there's also an internal discussion now within the PYD, within the Kurdish areas. Are we going for a Kurdish project or are we going for something else? I don't think there's an answer, to be honest. But what I do know is that the outcome in Raqqa and in Deir ez-Zor will ultimately decide how this all plays out. Because at the end of the day, demographically, Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor are Sunni Arabs, tribes, and they have a long problematic history with the Kurds. Frankly, if there could be a serious, pragmatic discussion between all the ethnic groups in Jazeera region about how to move forward, it could be a very stable, very prosperous region because it has mostly oil and the natural gas. It's the wheat basket of Syria. It has the majority of Syria's water. It's an area that could provide extreme stability and an anchor for that triangle of Turkey, Iraq, Syria. But there has to be massive political agreements and social compacts that have to be mended and recreated. And the United States and Turkey and probably Iran will all have to be part of that conversation, whether we like it or not.
May I actually add one line to that before we move to Hasan's perspective on this? What is good enough for the Syrian people? As some elements are going to Astana.
Yeah.
Is a question I know, difficult to answer, but from what you see, will they agree to say someone other than Assad ruling the state? However, not sort of ideal.
Right. This is a difficult question because, as I've said, Syrian opposition is not a monolithic structure. But I think having Assad gone and his immediate coterie of people will provide psychological catharsis to allow people to think about their future. Because right now, people can't think about their future. They're saying, how do I survive the next day? How do I survive the next week? You can't have difficult conversations about national identity or how we're going to put together your country when you're just thinking about day-to-day survival. So I think Assad, at the end of the day, still has to go. Who replaces him can be something, if it's a transitional government in which we have clear sets of rules in which the United States, Russia, and Iran each controls their side and enforces their side to adhere to that agreement. Yes, I think there could be a transition. And we also have a huge set of the bureaucratic portion of the Syrian state that's intact. You have a lot of people who defected from the state, who know how to run the state, who understand the bureaucracy. Those people haven't been used adequately. We haven't tapped into their knowledge to better understand how we would craft a different vision for Syria's governance structure going forward.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Actually, in order to have what is good enough, we need to first discuss the order of options for the actors in Syrian war. I think we need to have the options of those four states: Russia, the United States, Turkey, and Iran. And since Iran turned to be a junior partner of Russia, then I will just consider three states as the necessary partners of a solution in Syria: Russia, Turkey, and the United States. We already have an understanding of the order of the options of first two, Russia and Turkey. We are missing what are the American preferences for a solution in Syria. If we can discuss, for me, the best option for Russia is, number one option is Syria with Assad or someone like Assad. But the second option for Russia is Western Syria with Assad or someone like Assad. On the other side, for Turkey, the best option is Syria without Assad. The second option is northern Syria without PYD is the best second option for Turkey. The third best option for Turkey is territorial integrity. If we sum up all these, I can see that what is good enough in Syria is the territorial integrity for all parties in this fight. Territorial integrity, what I mean is the status quo ante is maybe the only solution for the Middle East. That's the only good enough for all others. But we will see what Trump administration's preferences will be, and probably that will define which solution will be the good enough for all.
Yeah. This is quite the complex matrix that maybe Trump's business acumen might plug into some sort of.
He's just going to cut the Gordian knot, maybe.
But, maybe being too hopeful. Okay, so another question from the field. Yes, please.
Lydia Jabs at the Middle East Institute. Luke, I wanted to address your claim that there are no moderates left in Syria. If you could explain why you believe this to be true, and if so, how can the United States combat the spread of extremist rhetoric that is a much more complex issue than simply defeating ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other groups with military force?
Yeah, caveat to that statement by saying the moderates that are left aren't organized or aren't big enough to tilt the outcome one way or the other in a way that the U.S. would like. And also the term moderate is a very subjective term. I don't feel comfortable arming groups that have ties to Wahhabism, Salafist links. That's just my personal opinion. I just don't think that the U.S. should be doing that. just because there's a civil war happening in a country does not mean that the U.S. has to pick a side. I know that's not very popular, but that's the truth. And I think we should be thinking very hard and long before we do pick sides, because like I said, it seems like the more desperate we get, the more moderate these rebel groups become. And I'm open. I mean, if someone can identify.
The more moderate or the more?
They believe the more desperate we become on how to solve Syria, then it's like, well, all these moderate groups are out there that we can arm and organize to tackle Assad and then defeat ISIS, or do both at the same time. And I personally think it's fantasy from a military point of view that the U.S. is able to engineer an outcome in Syria that would benefit us. And sometimes we should just say, it's unsolvable for the United States. The U.S. cannot solve every problem in the world. And one problem we can't solve is definitely the civil war. The counterterrorism aspect to that, ISIS, that's a different matter. But this conflict has been allowed to rot and fester for so long. And we are to where we are today, where we had that horrific situation in Aleppo. I mean, horrific what was happening there. And you kept hearing these slogans like, we can't let Aleppo fall. Aleppo can't fall. Well, what does that mean? I mean, does that mean we deploy the 82nd Airborne Division into Aleppo to defend it alongside some of these groups who, let's be honest, are on the fringes or teeter along the edges of extremism? I just don't see how that's a viable outcome for the U.S. in the long term.
That reminds me of a more outspoken voice of several Obama interviews on the subject. I mean, I feel like you are sort of saying the administration policy was more or less inevitable in some ways, I mean, given how things have progressed. And I want to actually ask, in regards to this, how in the new era the interagency sort of process may affect this. Now, we don't know how the new administration will be on this, but the White House had a tight grip on foreign policy. Now it's Mattis, if everything goes well, in the DOD, and then Tillerman, State, Flynn in the picture. Where do you see, conversation, different sensibilities of different institutional preferences? There's a special ops component to all of this.
Yes, of course,
Flynn comes from that background.
I mean, I will say that, there are great arguments on the other side of my argument that I respect. And at the end of the day, we all want to see the killing stop in Syria. But in some cases, there's no moral obligation to do what you can't do. And I'm just asking that the future U.S. policymakers inject a bit of realism on what we're actually able to do on the ground in Syria. And in terms of your question about interagency conflict and how all this plays out, I get the impression that the Trump administration, at least in the earlier days, is going to be heavily focused on the domestic agenda.
Are we sure about that? Because moral responsibility and playing realistically, okay, it's the correct word. If you can't do, then trying to do is not morally required. But if you can do something, are we sure that there's nothing that the United States can do in the case of Aleppo or in the case of all other Syrian territories? Are we sure about that? There's nothing that the United States can do?
I mean, I think, there was a discussion at least, and I would be curious to see, what the panel thinks about this, but I would assume that, in the UN, the sort of, I don't know how the Nikki Haley will approach
because
this,
I know many other
Pavel,
examples.
for example, is known
I tell you what could have been done with Aleppo. Aleppo was literally burning, and the Arab world was fiddling. The Arab League has not even issued a statement acknowledging the atrocities or criticizing what was going on in Aleppo. But yes, the U.S.'s responsibility and the U.S.'s problem to defend Aleppo from the Assad regime. Look, I know this isn't very popular probably in this room, but I'm just trying to be honest with you and tell you where I think that U.S. national security interests lie. I mean, if our standard to intervene militarily is to go into every place where there is a crisis like Aleppo, then there are half dozen places around the world that we could go into. And the U.S. Family is not going to want to send their sons and daughters into harm's way if there's not a direct U.S. national security interest. And I'll tell you what the U.S. needs to be doing, since I said what the U.S. shouldn't be doing. The number one thing the U.S. needs to do on the counterterrorism front is working with our counterintelligence agencies, our counterterrorism agencies, with our allies that focus on counterterrorism, counterintelligence, improve our homeland security, our domestic law enforcement capabilities, our FBI capabilities and whatnot, to make sure that any attacks in the U.S. or in our allies can be prevented. Terrorism is going to be stopped at home first, because we could kill every ISIS fighter in northern Syria, and all it takes is one to go to Union Station and blow himself up to look like ISIS is the winner. So counterterrorism starts with homeland security. Second thing we need to do is help in the same way the countries that border Syria, to help them with their security sector reform, to help them with their counterterrorism capabilities, so they can do the same thing to protect their own people. And this includes Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, Israel, Lebanon. We need to do the same to help them. And then the U.S. needs to do more to help with the refugees. The goal of U.S. refugee policy should be to keep the refugee as close to their home as possible. And this means providing more financial support, more infrastructure and logistical support to the countries in the region, especially Turkey, which are carrying this heavy burden with refugees. And then after that, we need to show some leadership in the Middle East. When I was a cadet in the Army and I was having this basic leadership class, I was told that the definition of leadership is to convince others to do what they otherwise would not want to do. It's time the U.S. leads in the Middle East, use the leverage that we have to get the countries in the region, the Arab countries, to take more of a responsibility on confronting the challenges in Syria. The black flag of the caliphate will never fly over the Capitol dome, I promise you. But there is a possibility it could fly over some of the Gulf Emirates. It could fly over Mecca and Medina. They need to wake up to this threat that they face.
I think, some actors face, and then I think Sasha wanted to get into this, but I will just say that speaking or thinking purely from an American interest point of view, for that one militant to either try to justify the attack, to even get radicalized in the first place, what's going on in the region, definitely sort of has an impact. And I would just, this is my dilemma when I think about this. Yeah. When people talk in regards to American interests, isn't that sort of, in the long term a more direct threat? But Sasha, I'll let you, and then we'll get back to
this. Just quickly, I think that the collapse of Syria, which is sucking the entire Middle East with it, is a number one or number two security interest for this country. Having the heart of the Middle East destabilized and having half of its population either expelled to the neighboring regions or internally displaced is inherently bad for the United States. The way to combat extremism is by providing and supporting consistent, clear governance structures that provide social services, and by supporting civil society. At the end of the day, we can't, as he said, we can't kill every ISIS person and defeat their ideology. You can't defeat an ideology with a bullet. But you can defeat an ideology by negating its necessity and by making it irrelevant in the daily lives of people on the ground. And right now in Syria, Russia and the Assad regime are bombing anywhere and everywhere the opposition exists in order to create chaos, because extremism breeds well in chaos. If all of the local governance structures and institutions and civil society organizations just even had 6 months of no bombing to be able to function and operate, you will see, I guarantee it, you will see extreme amount of backlash against groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and other extremist groups, because at the end of the day, from my experiences, Syria is a moderate, pluralistic society. Mm-hmm. I think people would return to that narrative and would prefer to return to that narrative, provided they're not being bombed day in and day out. So I think that there are things that have to be done with the international community to allow the circumstances and the environment on the ground to provide positive incentives and positive environment for people to survive in. Leaving 1 or 2 million IDPs in the open-air prison that northwestern Syria has become, being bombed every day. I mean, we'll have generations of people being exposed to terrorism and generations of people who feel that they've been left behind and isolated by the international community. That doesn't do anything good for the United States.
Absolutely. Okay, so see one hand back over there.
Blaise Michdal, the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you to SETA for hosting this forum and to the panelists for the discussion, especially this last juxtaposition between Sasha and Luke. Your visions of
We try to keep it interesting for everyone.
Well, I think it's a very worthwhile and very timely discussion. But to the extent that my reading of the Twitter tea leaves is accurate, it seems that Mr. Trump's foreign policy, his instincts at least, are more in line with Luke's than Sasha's. And to the extent that this panel, I think, has made clear, and Mr. Trump has made clear, that what happens next is going to be determined by Raqqa, and how Raqqa is taken, and Mr. Trump has made clear that he wants Raqqa very badly. We've heard from General Dunford in recent days that he is offering new options to Mr. Trump about how to accelerate the campaign against ISIS in Raqqa. I wanted to hear more from you on what the options are. Dr. Yalcin, I agree that maybe we might get to a point where we send in U.S. troops, but that's really not going to be the first option. The first option is going to be looking for local forces to provide boots on the ground. And to the extent that we've heard that the YPG might not be the best option, I'd be interested in what you think the other options are and how they might contribute to regional stability and to the integrity of Syria in a way that the YPG would not. As far as I can tell, there aren't significant Russian boots on the ground, so it won't be Russia. The Syrian army is somewhat devastated, and its boots on the ground are actually being provided by Hezbollah and Iran. The Turkish military has a readiness crisis that Luke laid out. So what are the other options that a sounder U.S. policy could take? Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just shortly?
Sure, please.
Yeah, it's not the first option, clearly, but we are not taking our first options. Turkey has its first, second, third options, but it's not taking those first options. So there might be someday come and someone has to take the necessary option instead of the first option. And from my observation up until right now, we can see that without the U.S. intervention, there will be no clean Raqqa. And nobody will take that responsibility by itself. Without U.S. troops, neither PYD nor Iranian troops, nor others can easily clean Raqqa. Without U.S. troops on the field, there will be no free Raqqa. That's why I argue that U.S. troops, in one way or another, will come on the ground.
See, I respectfully disagree because I don't see U.S. soldiers being welcomed in Raqqa any more than YPG fighters. There has to be a local solution to this, and I think that the liberators of Raqqa have to be, preferably would be of the Sunni Arab variety. I don't know where they're going to come from, but I do know one thing. We spend billions of dollars, or we don't spend, actually. We sell billions of dollars of high advanced military kit to some of our closest allies in the Middle East. We train their officer corps. It's time that we lead I'm not against the idea of the U.S. getting involved militarily in the liberation of Raqqa or the defeat of ISIS. We already are involved militarily, but more involved militarily. But what I'm saying is we need to, it's time that we lead. And to lead in the Middle East, we have to restore America's credibility in the region. I'm always thinking about this expression used. There's this lady called Emma Skye, a British lady who advised General Odierno in Iraq. And she wrote this book, and in her book about her experiences, she describes America as the biggest tribe in the Middle East, or the strongest tribe or something. She said, whether America likes it or not, whether we want to admit it or not, right now we're the most powerful tribe in the Middle East. The problem is we're not acting like it. So if we really have national interests at stake, like we were told, in Syria, then it's time that we get our tribesmen together and we figure out a regional and local solution to the crisis we face. Because I can promise you, if we send the 82nd Airborne Division into Raqqa to liberate it, in 20 years from now, we're going to be sending the 173rd Airborne Division into some other city in the Middle East to liberate that. We can't keep doing this. We have to enable the locals to do it. It's better that they do it tolerably than we do it perfectly. It could take longer, could be bloodier, but that's the reality.
So, but that means then the special ops involvement will likely continue. I mean, or even this.
For sure, that would be a component, yeah. But large numbers of U.S. ground forces, I just don't see it happening.
I have some specifics on
Sure,
this because
please.
I follow this very closely. All right, first, we need to go back and talk with all the Raqqa tribal groups who fought Assad. They're still there, they still exist, and they're ready to go fight. They need U.S. support, and they need to be able to create a parallel military structure that's not under the control of the SDF. If they have this, they'll go and fight, and they would be more than happy to go back to Raqqa City, where many of them are from, and deal with it in their way. I don't think the U.S. military is going to back off from using the SDF, so for now, the SDF will be a way to sweep through other areas, but a central core issue that has not been addressed is Tabqa Dam. This dam provides hydroelectric power and water. It is a key resource. Whoever holds the dam has key leverage over the central government structure in the future and leverage over Jazeera region. My preference would be to have U.S. Special Forces and perhaps Turkish Special Forces do a joint operation to hold the dam in trust until a final political agreement about Syria's future can be reached. That way, neither the Kurds, nor the Arabs, nor anyone specific has control of the dam and can use it as leverage in future negotiations. In terms of Raqqa City, absolutely. Raqqa people themselves should be liberating it. The forces exist, the people exist, they're ready to fight, but we need to get the YPG and the PYD to agree to have them participate fully, and for that, if we need to have a buffer, my preference is to bring some of the Peshmerga. Peshmerga and Barzani have had clear discussions with the Turkish government. The Turkish government allowed them to come in and help defend Kobani and use Turkey as a pass-through to do it. I think we could have some discussions and equilibrium there that would allow everyone to facilitate and participate in a joint military campaign together.
Absolutely. Okay. We have, I think, time for one quick question, if there is any. Yes, please.
I have a short question for Luke.
Sorry, I don't think you're...
Yeah, if you could or speak up.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Yes.
My question is for Luke. So I really, I listened to his speech, so it was mostly about Kurds. Is it okay now?
Yeah, but could you also identify yourself as well?
This is Mustafa Akar from VOA. So during his speech, I really noticed I feel I'm in Turkey, and Luke was one of the Turkish nationalists, and the way he approached Kurds was really unfair. And he really demonized Kurdish value. Kurds are in the Middle East, which is secular society, which is, and especially in KRG. KRG is the only place in the Middle East after Israel. The Jewish population and the Christian population is growing. They are hosting 1.8 million refugees in the KRG, and they are the most effective power fighting against ISIS. So I'm just surprised why you approach Kurds this way, because for 80 years in Turkey, really they didn't accept the Kurdish reality, and ruling party, which AKP, they just came and they changed that reality. They say, no, Kurds are there. So, and the way you approach these Kurds, it's really surprised me. So do you think we should, no, Kurds are more dangerous than ISIS in the Middle East or not? Because the way the conclusion of your speech really give me that idea, because in entire speech we didn't.
I have to admit I am slightly...
We didn't talk about ISIS. ISIS is the main world problem, and Kurds are really fighting for humanity.
Okay.
I am slightly puzzled by your question, because I criticize the U.S. policy community of doing exactly what you're accusing me of, unless I misspoke. I made it very clear that it's time we stop being lazy on the different Kurdish groups, and we finally focus on the difference between the sea of acronyms and realize that the KRG is not the same as the PKK, which is not the same as the YPG. I don't know, maybe I didn't make that clear. So I actually agree with you. Perhaps you misunderstood me. But without it, I would never, ever lump in the YPG with the KRG in the same basket of Kurds. I don't have one basket of Kurds. I have many baskets.
Thank you so much. So we have a long day to come, 2 more panels, exciting panels. We just, I think, gave a glimpse of what's to come. But please join me in thanking our panelists, Luke Coffey from Heritage Foundation, Sasha Ghosh-Siminoff from People Demand Change, and Hasan Basri Yalcin from SETA Foundation.